December 17, 1944, in the frozen Belgian town of Shomburg. Sergeant Curtis Adams sat hunched against the bitter cold, his fingers stiff as he composed what he knew would be his final letter back home to South Carolina. The words he scratched onto paper would never make it to his family. He understood that much, but he had to try. "They think we cannot fight," he wrote. "The enemy believes everything their propaganda tells them about inferior soldiers. But today, we will show them exactly what black artillerymen are capable of." Today, everything changes. Through the thick winter fog that clung to the ground, Adams had just witnessed something enormous unfold. The opening barrage of Germany's last desperate throw of the dice had begun across the Ardennes. The sky itself seemed to split open with the roar of countless guns. Artillery shells tore through the air overhead, their sound like nothing on earth. German panzers were pushing through snow-covered forests, metal grinding over ice and frozen ground. This was it. The major German offensive in the West had commenced. The very thing everyone had been dreading. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, positioned near the German border, found itself sitting directly in the path of three entire German armies pushing westward. Everything depended on what happened in the next hours and days. Back in Berlin, Nazi ideology had drilled into German officers a specific belief about American soldiers of African descent. They were subhuman, so the thinking went. Incapable of discipline, incapable of courage, incapable of effective combat. Completely inferior in every measurable way. But here, in the grinding crucible of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, this segregated African-American artillery battalion would undergo a trial that would transform everything. Half its men would become casualties as they poured devastating fire onto German positions. And German commanders would find themselves questioning everything they had ever been taught about race and what it meant to wage war effectively. The story of this battalion began much earlier. The foundation was laid on August 5, 1942, at Camp Gruber in Oklahoma. That was when the 333rd Field Artillery Regiment activated as an official segregated unit. The Army paperwork classified them coldly as a colored unit. The battalion consisted of 540 enlisted men and 30 officers, equipped with the M155mm howitzer. These were serious weapons. Each gun weighed 12,000 pounds and could hurl a 95-pound shell across 14,000 yards. The battalion organized itself into 5 separate batteries. There was Able Battery, Baker Battery, Charlie Battery, Service Battery, and Headquarters Battery. Each firing battery contained 4 howitzers. 11 soldiers operated each gun with a precision that demanded intelligence, mathematical skill, and split-second timing where mistakes could kill everyone. Command fell to Lieutenant Colonel Harmon Kelsey, a white officer drawn from the regular army. Like virtually every segregated unit in World War II, white officers led these black enlisted men. This structure mirrored and reinforced the racial tensions running through the nation itself. America was fighting fascism on foreign soil while practicing segregation at home. Yet the men of the 333rd would eventually prove something powerful, that courage and competence transcended race entirely. Training at Camp Gruber stretched through all of 1942 and into 1943. The camp sat about 18 miles outside Muskogee, Oklahoma, some 61 miles southeast of Tulsa. The location was no accident. The Army chose the Deep South deliberately. Segregation was already the law of the land there. Jim Crow restrictions were written into local custom and statute. The familiar restrictions on African American life were already baked into the system. The soldiers who arrived understood exactly what they faced. Most came from southern states where discrimination wasn't just practiced, it was law. They had lived within inequality their entire lives. Now they would receive training to fight against fascism while simultaneously experiencing American racism firsthand. The contradiction was suffocating and inescapable. The training itself demanded everything. The soldiers mastered artillery, then moved into mathematics. They learned to calculate trajectories that required real understanding of physics, geometry, and meteorology. Every fire mission depended on rapid mental computation, distance to target, elevation angle, powder charge, wind speed, and direction. temperature, humidity, air pressure, every single variable affected where the shell would land. A single-degree error in elevation could throw the shot hundreds of yards off target. A miscalculation of wind drift could send shells into friendly positions and kill American soldiers. The mathematics were complex and absolutely unforgiving. Yet these men mastered the complex calculations even while operating under intense time pressure. They learned to use slide rules and consulted firing tables. They memorized ballistic coefficients and trajectory curves. They practiced mental arithmetic until they could work out firing solutions in seconds flat. Their performance proved something that racist ideology wanted to deny, that intelligence and mathematical ability had absolutely nothing to do with race. Many of these soldiers had come from segregated schools that lacked adequate resources. Yet they mastered artillery science as well as any white unit in the entire army. They practiced loading the massive shells. Each projectile weighed 95 pounds of high explosive, white phosphorus, or smoke. The loading had to be precise. The powder charge had to go in correctly. The breech had to close properly. Any mistake could kill the entire crew instantly. The loader had to lift the heavy shell from the ground, carry it to the breech, and ram it home in one smooth motion. The powder man had to select the correct charge from 7 available options. Each choice produced different velocities and ranges. Get it wrong, and the shell goes somewhere unexpected. The breechman had to close and lock the mechanism, ensuring a perfect seal. The gunner had to set elevation and deflection with precision, measured in mils, a unit so fine that 1 mil equals 1 yard of deviation at 1,000 yards distance. The men learned to work as unified teams. Each soldier performed his specific tasks in perfect sequence. Load, aim, fire, repeat. Speed and accuracy were everything. A well-trained crew could fire 3 rounds per minute. The 333rd crews achieved this rate consistently during training. They often exceeded it. Their howitzers sent thunder rolling across the Oklahoma plains, shells traveling toward distant targets with devastating accuracy. Range officers documented everything they saw. The scores these men achieved matched or exceeded those of white artillery battalions training at the same facility. The evidence was undeniable. They trained in displacing their heavy weapons across terrain. The 155mm howitzer weighed 12,000 pounds. The gun had to be hitched to a truck, moved to a new position, unhitched, leveled, aimed, and made ready to fire. All of this had to happen within minutes. In actual combat, artillery batteries had to displace rapidly to avoid counter-battery fire. German artillery observers would spot the muzzle flashes of American guns and call down fire on those positions. Survival depended entirely on firing a mission and moving before German shells arrived. The 333rd practiced this evolution until it became automatic, something the body and mind could execute without conscious thought. They could displace a 4-gun battery, move 3 miles to a new location, set up in new positions, and resume firing within 30 minutes. This speed required coordination between dozens of men, multiple vehicles, and tons of equipment. It required each soldier to know not just his own job, but everyone else's job as well. If one man fell wounded, another had to take his place instantly without hesitation. The battalion practiced until these movements became instinctive. They trained on communication procedures because artillery depended entirely on accurate information from forward observers positioned with the infantry. These observers, often miles away from the guns, would spot targets and radio back precise coordinates. The fire direction center would calculate firing solutions. The guns would shoot. The observer would watch where the shells landed and call corrections. Left 50 yards, add 200 yards, fire for effect. This cycle repeated dozens of times in every single engagement. Communication had to be clear, precise, and fast. The men learned radio procedure and telephone operation. They practiced sending and receiving fire missions until they could execute them perfectly, even under extreme pressure. They memorized code words and authentication procedures. They learned to recognize voice patterns so they could identify who was calling, even when static crackled heavily across the line. They practiced until communication became second nature, something they could do without thinking. Camp Gruber itself embodied all of America's contradictions. The Army demanded excellence from these men, while denying them basic dignity. Facilities were segregated, mess halls were separate, recreation areas were divided by race. Post buildings had separate entrances for black soldiers. White officers led black enlisted men. The army maintained racial separation as strictly as any southern town maintained its Jim Crow laws. Yet it expected these same segregated soldiers to perform at the highest possible levels. The men could not eat at the same tables as white soldiers. They could not use the same restrooms. They could not attend the same movie screenings at the base theater. When they went to nearby towns on leave, they faced Jim Crow laws that restricted where they could eat, sleep, or even walk on the street. They were training to fight for American democracy while being denied the basic rights of American citizens. Yet the men of the 333rd accepted the contradiction because they understood what was truly at stake. This was their chance to prove themselves in combat. This was their opportunity to demonstrate that black soldiers were the equals of white soldiers in every conceivable way. They would not waste this opportunity. They trained harder than required. They practiced longer than ordered. They pushed themselves to achieve excellence because they knew they would be judged more harshly than white units. One mistake by a black unit would be seized as evidence of racial inferiority. One failure would confirm every prejudice their enemies held. They could not afford to fail. In early 1943, the Army reorganized artillery units. The 333rd Regiment broke apart into different components. The 1st Battalion became the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. The 2nd Battalion became the 969th Field Artillery Battalion. Regimental headquarters transformed into the 333rd Field Artillery Group, which would command multiple battalions in combat. Both the 333rd and 969th were African-American units with mostly white officers. They would serve as corps artillery, moving between divisions as tactical needs demanded, rather than being permanently attached to one infantry division. The 333rd shipped to England in February 1944. On June 29th, they landed at Utah Beach in Normandy. War found them immediately. Within hours of landing, the battalion fired its first combat rounds, supporting the breakout from the beachhead itself. The guns were positioned in hedgerow country, the dense Norman bocage that severely limited visibility and channeled all movement into predictable corridors. Every field became a potential killing ground. Every hedgerow concealed German defensive positions. The 333rd provided fire support for advancing infantry. Forward observers moved with the assault troops, calling back coordinates of German strongpoints. The howitzers responded with devastating accuracy. High explosive shells crashed into German positions, destroying bunkers and scattering defenders across the landscape. The infantry advanced behind the artillery barrage, taking objectives that would have cost hundreds of casualties without this fire support. Through July and August, they battled across Brittany in continuous brutal fighting. German forces cut off by the Allied breakout from Normandy fought desperately to hold the Brittany ports. Every town became a battlefield. Every bridge was defended. Every crossroads was contested. The 333rd fired thousands of rounds in support of advancing infantry pushing forward through the countryside. At the Siege of Brest, their accurate fire demolished German fortifications that had withstood weeks of infantry assault. The Germans had converted the port city into a fortress. Concrete bunkers, 6 feet thick, protected German positions. Interlocking fields of fire covered every approach. Minefields surrounded the perimeter. The garrison of troops and naval personnel numbered over 30,000 men, with orders to hold to the very last man. The city could not be taken by infantry alone. It required artillery, massive amounts of artillery, firing continuously day and night without pause. The 333rd's howitzers provided the firepower that broke the German defense. High explosive shells weighing 95 pounds smashed through reinforced concrete. Each shell contained 19 pounds of TNT. When it detonated inside a bunker, the explosion was devastating. Walls cracked, roofs collapsed, defenders were killed by blast and concussion. Direct hits collapsed bunkers entirely, burying everyone inside. Near misses shook the structures, stunning the defenders and making accurate return fire impossible. The battalion fired in carefully coordinated shoots. Forward observers identified targets. Fire direction centers calculated firing solutions. All 4 guns of a battery fired simultaneously, sending 4 shells toward the same target. The shells landed within seconds of each other, multiplying the destructive effect. Then the guns fired again and again. The continuous bombardment gave the defenders no respite, no chance to recover, no opportunity to repair damage or reorganize. The precision of the fire impressed even hardened infantry veterans. Officers who had fought through North Africa and Sicily said they had never seen better artillery support. The shells landed exactly where needed. Targets were destroyed efficiently without wasted ammunition. When infantry requested fire, the 333rd responded within minutes. When infantry needed fire lifted because they were advancing, the guns stopped instantly. This level of coordination required skill, discipline, and constant communication flowing in all directions. French civilians watched in amazement as Black American soldiers operated sophisticated artillery with deadly precision. Many had never seen African Americans before. Some had absorbed racist propaganda from both Vichy France and Nazi Germany. They expected ignorance and incompetence. They witnessed something completely different. The artillery crews worked with mechanical efficiency. Each man knew his job perfectly. Each task was performed smoothly and correctly. The guns fired with rhythmic precision, load, aim, fire, repeat, hour after hour, day after day. Forward observers called coordinates in perfect military procedure. Radio transmissions were clear and professional. Target location, type of target, requested ammunition type. The Fire Direction Center acknowledged, calculated, and issued fire commands. The guns responded instantly. Shells landed exactly where intended. Targets were destroyed with minimal wasted ammunition. This was not luck or accident. This was skill and training and discipline applied under the pressure of combat. The soldiers who served in that artillery battalion embodied something far greater than military competence. They carried themselves with a quiet professionalism that commanders throughout the divisions could not ignore. Each battle they fought only deepened their reputation. Officers in the field began asking for them by name when the fighting grew most intense. When an enemy strongpoint had to be eliminated, the request came down for that particular unit. When an offensive required devastating firepower, headquarters called on them again and again. Word traveled fast through the divisions they supported. The Black Artillery Unit possessed skills that matched any other in the entire army. They were that good, equally good, as capable as any outfit you could find anywhere. Division officers wrote detailed reports praising their accuracy and quick response to fire requests. The official documents told the story in straightforward military language that made the quality undeniable. A report from the 2nd Infantry Division praised the 333 Field Artillery Battalion for providing fire support beyond what anyone expected, with their accuracy, speed, and professional conduct setting them apart. Another assessment highlighted how their forward observers showed remarkable bravery and ability, frequently working far in front of friendly positions to direct fire against German targets. These evaluations came from combat, not politics. Professional military officers wrote these assessments based solely on what worked and what didn't. The 333 produced results that spoke for themselves. Their shots found their targets, they answered requests without delay, their partnership with infantry units ran like clockwork. They excelled at everything they attempted. Military records showed how effective they truly were. In one 24-hour stretch, the battalion fired 1,500 shells, pushing their gun barrels so hard they heated until they glowed bright red. Through direct artillery fire alone, they captured the French village of Saint-Jose, something artillery rarely accomplished. Infantry commanders repeatedly requested their support because their forward observers called in targeting information with such precision that the shells landed exactly where needed. By October 1944, after constant months of battle, the 333 received orders to take control of a new sector. The Ardennes region where Belgium met Germany had experienced very little combat. Military leadership felt the challenging landscape made it unsuitable for any serious offensive action. The newly arrived 106 Infantry Division would maintain the line. The 3003 Field Artillery Group, which included the 3003 and 969 battalions, would supply artillery assistance. The battalion took up positions surrounding Schomburg, a small village near Saint-Vith, Belgium. Service battery settled into locations west of the river. Batteries Abel, Baker, and Charlie spread out to the east, positioned 11 miles behind where the fighting occurred. Everything felt remarkably peaceful, almost like a garrison posting, as army reports later described it. The men constructed well-built positions. They put up log structures and insulated tents instead of fighting holes. They opened a recreation facility with a beer hall, bowling lanes, and even badminton equipment. A Christmas musical theatre production came together. Leaves to Paris and nearby Belgian towns happened regularly. These soldiers, worn out from months of heavy combat, finally found themselves in calm conditions. They had no idea they were positioned directly where Germany planned its most ambitious attack. Master Sergeant Floyd Jones from the 333 would recall those final calm moments many years later. Our morale was outstanding. The soldiers were refreshed, properly nourished, correctly supplied. Our artillery pieces were in excellent working order. We had plenty of ammunition stored. Everything looked good. We expected to spend the winter quietly before things picked back up in spring. Then the 16th of December came and the world erupted. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, German artillery opened fire all along the Ardennes front. Shells whistled in from hundreds of hidden gun positions. For 90 minutes the bombardment continued without stopping, then came a silence that felt worse than the explosions. Through the winter mist appeared dark shapes of German armor, tanks and assault guns moving west in great waves. 3 German armies, totaling 28 divisions and 250,000 soldiers, launched Operation Wacht and Rhine. Hitler's final desperate attempt to drive a wedge between the Allies, seize Antwerp, and force peace negotiations. The 106th Infantry Division, having held the line for less than 2 weeks, faced overwhelming attack from multiple directions. 2 of its 3 regiments got surrounded almost immediately. The division stretched across 26 miles of front, when proper military doctrine called for only 5 miles per division maximum. The line fractured. German soldiers poured through the broken sections, racing westward toward the critical road junction at Bastogne. The 333 Field Artillery Battalion learned of the breakthrough at 8 in the morning. Master Sergeant Jones remembered how it happened. We were just standing around waiting for instructions when word arrived that the Germans had broken through. Everything shifted immediately. Things had gotten serious. The peaceful area had suddenly become critical to the entire German strategy. The battalion's forward observers, positioned in Blackhild village, started requesting fire support right away. Captain William McLeod's battery, Charlie, reacted within minutes. The howitzers sent 95-pound explosive shells arcing toward German positions. The fire hit exactly where it needed to. Germans expecting to walk into Blackhild by midday instead found themselves held down by perfectly aimed artillery. Charlie's gunners kept firing throughout the morning, helping to delay the German advance, yet everything kept getting worse. The 106th Division's artillery officer, General McMahon, ordered the 333 and 969 battalions to start pulling westward. But he desperately wanted several batteries to remain behind firing cover while the division withdrew, promising them the main positions would hold and they had nothing to worry about. His judgment proved catastrophically mistaken. Batteries Abel and Baker from the 333 began moving their howitzers, trucks, and supplies along snow-covered paths. Battery Charlie and Service Battery got different instructions: hold your positions, keep firing, give the 106th Division time to escape. The soldiers understood the risk. They stayed anyway. Throughout that December 16th, Battery Charlie fired constantly. Germans attacked American positions. American observers called for fire. The 333's guns responded to every request. The howitzers fired so much that ammunition supplies began running dangerously low. They kept going. As night approached, everything became dire. German breakthrough forces had gotten around both sides. Battery Charlie and Service Battery were now surrounded, still firing to help American units caught behind the advancing Germans. By morning on December 17th, Germans held Schomburg and controlled the river crossing near Saint-Vith. Service Battery attempted to push through the village to safety. German tanks and infantry struck with overwhelming force. Many soldiers died instantly. Survivors became prisoners. A German truck convoy carrying the captured Americans got attacked by Allied aircraft, causing deaths on both sides. Battery Charlie faced the same horror. German soldiers overran their positions. Some gunners grabbed rifles and fought as infantry. Others tried to disable their howitzers to keep them from German hands. Battery Commander Captain William McLeod fought with his men until German fire killed him. Technical Sergeant William Pritchett rallied a defense that let soldiers escape. He died protecting their retreat. Private First Class George Davis operated a machine gun until German bullets brought him down. By the morning of December 18th, the 333 Field Artillery Battalion lay shattered. 6 officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Kelsey and 222 enlisted men, were dead or captured. 9 howitzers, 34 trucks, and 12 weapons carriers sat destroyed. The battalion took more casualties than any other artillery unit in the 8th Corps during that opening assault. Out of roughly 540 soldiers, only 286 remained. The 333 had lost more than half its strength in 2 terrible days. Yet 11 men from Battery Charlie and Service Battery escaped the German forces. Private First Class George Davis, Jr. of Alabama, Private First Class James Leatherwood of Mississippi, Private First Class Robert Green of Georgia, Technical Sergeant Thomas Forte of Mississippi, Technical 4th Grade William Pritchett of Alabama, Private First Class Nathaniel Moss of Texas, Private First Class George Moten of Texas, Private First Class James Stewart of West Virginia, Technical 4th Grade Curtis Adams of South Carolina, Private First Class Major Bradley of Mississippi, and Private First Class Dew Turner of Arkansas. These 11 soldiers walked 10 miles through freezing snow and brutal cold trying to reach American positions. Around 3 in the afternoon on December 17th, exhausted and nearly frozen solid, they approached a small farmhouse in Veerith, Belgium. Matthias Langer owned the property. Inside were Matthias, his wife Maria, their 12-year-old son Hermann, and a visiting family friend. The 11 soldiers knocked, asking for shelter. Desperate, cold, and starving, they possessed just 2 rifles among them all. The Langer family brought them inside. Maria prepared meals. The soldiers ate, rested, warmed themselves beside the fire. Young Hermann Langer would carry the memory of those soldiers sitting at his kitchen table for his entire life. Yet this corner of Belgium held complications. The region had belonged to Germany until after World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles gave it to Belgium. Many people still considered themselves German. Some welcomed the Wehrmacht's return. A neighbor who supported Germany observed the American soldiers. That neighbor reported them to a German patrol. The patrol belonged to the 1st SS Panzer Division, Adolf Hitler's most devoted Nazi unit, the most extreme force in the German military. The Germans arrived at the Langer home. The 11 American soldiers faced surrender. They left peacefully, hands raised, respecting the laws of warfare. Germans marched them down the path toward a wide, snow-covered field. Away from viewing eyes, the SS revealed Nazi ideology's true nature. They beat the prisoners with rifle stocks and kicks. They broke limbs with strikes and stomping. They removed fingers. They stabbed men through eyes and head with bayonets. They shot soldiers attempting to help wounded comrades. They tortured 11 defenseless men for one reason: they were black. Nazi racial doctrine viewed them as less than human. The Wehrmacht had taught its soldiers that African Americans were beneath animals. When Allied troops retook the area 8 weeks later, they found bodies frozen in the snow. Torture signs covered everything everywhere: shattered bone structure, stab wounds, severe mutilation. The American military launched an investigation. Investigators recorded every detail. They talked to the Langer family and local witnesses. They took photographs. They named each victim. Yet inexplicably, nothing else occurred. Unlike the Malmedy massacre involving white American prisoners, which sparked numerous war crimes trials, the Wehrith massacre generated no prosecutions, no hearings, no accountability. The 11 men from the 333 Field Artillery Battalion were killed, examined, then erased from memory. While those 11 died at Wehrith, the 333 survivors kept fighting. Batteries Abel and Baker had successfully pulled away from their positions and moved toward Bastogne. They reached this vital junction just as German forces began tightening their circle. The 333's remaining soldiers combined with the 969 Field Artillery Battalion, their sister unit that had escaped intact. Together, these African-American artillerymen would participate in one of the most remarkable defensive achievements in American military history. Bastogne sat where 7 major roads through the Ardennes intersected. Whoever possessed Bastogne controlled the entire region's movement. German leaders desperately needed it. American commanders knew they had to hold it regardless of the cost. Major General Troy Middleton, who commanded the 8th Corps, sent the 101 Airborne Division to Bastogne. Paratroopers arrived by truck on December 18th and 19th. They lacked artillery support. They possessed limited supplies and urgently needed firepower. The 333 and 969 delivered it. The surviving 333 soldiers, now roughly 140 men with 5 howitzers, merged into the 969's structure. They arranged their guns in a protective ring surrounding Bastogne. Forward observers moved up with the paratroopers. Radio connections got established. Ammunition was stored in piles. The exhausted survivors prepared to fight once more. This time, they would fight alongside company. Paratroopers, tank destroyer battalions, engineer units, and several tanks formed a joint defense. Yet artillery would determine everything. On December 20th, German armies completed the encirclement around Bastogne. The garrison sat trapped, cut off, facing multiple German divisions. The defending force numbered roughly 18,000. The attacking force exceeded 45,000. Germans delivered an ultimatum demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101, sent back his legendary 2-word response: nuts. The Bastogne battle truly began. Everything appeared hopeless. Artillery ammunition got limited to just 10 rounds per gun daily. Medical supplies dwindled. The food supplies ran lower with each passing day. Winter weather made it impossible for cargo planes to get through. Thick fog and heavy snow kept Allied aircraft grounded, which meant the Germans could strike whenever they wanted without worrying about being attacked from the air. The soldiers found themselves completely isolated. The men serving with the 333rd and 969th knew exactly what they were facing. These were black soldiers fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens back home. They were up against hardened Wehrmacht and SS units filled with men who believed Nazi racial doctrine that branded them as less than human. Capture or surrender meant almost certain death. From December 21st through the 23rd, the German forces hurled wave after wave of attacks at the perimeter surrounding Bastogne. Each assault followed the same brutal pattern. German guns would pound the American positions relentlessly, sometimes for half an hour or longer. The ground would shake. Explosions would tear through the frozen air. Then suddenly the shelling would stop. That's when the real danger began. Infantry and tanks would surge forward, trying to punch through while the defenders were still dazed and recovering from the bombardment. This was standard Wehrmacht playbook, the same method that had worked on battlefields across Poland, France, and Russia. But Bastogne was different. The American defenders had artillery of their own. More than that, they had black artillery. When the German attack started, so did the defensive fire. The men of the 333rd and 969th worked as a coordinated machine. Forward observers sat in the frozen trenches alongside the paratroopers, binoculars pressed to their eyes, watching German movements unfold below them. They spotted where German troops gathered before launching attacks. They caught the telltale flashes of German artillery revealing their positions. Information flowed back through the radio, coordinates transmitted with urgent precision. Deep in Bastogne's cellars and cellars, the fire direction centers sprang into action. Officers and sergeants crowded around maps and firing tables, working by candlelight, their fingers moving across calculations that had to be absolutely correct. A single mistake in math could mean American shells landing on American soldiers. The calculations took a few minutes. Then firing orders went out to the gun crews. Those crews were waiting in frozen gun pits where the thermometer rarely climbed above zero. Snow covered every surface. Men wore every piece of clothing they could find, but the cold still bit right through to the bone. Fingers went numb, toes ached with a deep, throbbing pain. Exhaustion made everything move in slow motion. Yet the moment the firing command arrived, something changed. Training took over. The crews moved with sharp, practiced efficiency. Their observers directed each shot with remarkable precision. The shells themselves weighed 95 pounds each and screamed through the air faster than 1,500 feet per second. When one of these rounds found its target, the results were catastrophic. A direct hit on a vehicle simply erased it from existence, along with everyone inside. A near miss would flip trucks upside down and shred their tires. If a shell landed near infantry, everyone within 30 yards faced death or serious wounds. The artillery crews used time-delayed fuses that made the shells even more lethal. A round would punch through a wall or roof, sail into the building, then explode inside. The blast trapped inside stone and wood created a pressure cooker of destruction. Walls blew outward, roofs caved in, anyone sheltering inside didn't stand a chance. This method proved particularly effective against German soldiers taking cover in the stone buildings scattered through the villages near Bastogne. White phosphorus rounds created additional horrors. These burned hotter than 5,000 degrees and couldn't be put out with water. The burning material clung to skin and burned through to the bone beneath. German soldiers hit by white phosphorus often died screaming in absolute agony. Even tough, veteran infantry feared white phosphorus rounds far more than regular explosive shells. When white phosphorus landed nearby, German troops would panic, scatter in different directions, and break apart as organized units. Their formations would collapse. Their cohesion would shatter. Throughout all this, the African-American artillery crews kept working with machine-like consistency, despite being bone-tired, freezing cold, and running out of ammunition. They'd been fighting almost continuously since December 20th without real rest. Sleep came in brief moments between fire missions. They ate cold rations while standing at the guns. There was never enough ammunition, which meant every single shell mattered. They couldn't afford to waste rounds on guesses or targets that weren't confirmed. The physical strain was overwhelming. Each 95-pound shell had to be pulled from storage, carried to the howitzer, and rammed into the chamber. After firing hundreds of rounds, the loaders were destroyed. Their backs screamed in pain. Their shoulders felt like they might tear apart. Their hands bled from gripping and handling the rough metal ammunition casings. But they kept going. Load, fire, load, fire. Hour after hour, the same brutal cycle repeated. The howitzers themselves couldn't take the punishment indefinitely. Powder residue built up inside the barrels after dozens of shots. The crews had to swab them clean with wet rags between fire missions. The breech mechanisms stiffened up in the cold and needed constant lubrication. Recoil systems started leaking hydraulic fluid that had to be constantly topped off. The guns were literally falling apart from overuse. There were no replacement parts anywhere, no mechanics available, no time for proper repairs. The crews improvised and found ways to keep the guns shooting through sheer willpower and creative problem-solving. As the fighting intensified, the 155mm howitzers ended up doing something they were never designed for. They began engaging in direct fire against targets they could actually see. Artillery pieces built to hit targets miles away were being pointed like rifles at German tanks and German soldiers only hundreds of yards away. This was something that tested courage and discipline to the absolute limit. Artillery crews trained to work far behind the lines, safe behind other soldiers. Now these men found themselves in the middle of combat, aiming weapons designed for distant targets at enemies they could see with their own eyes. Direct fire with a howitzer created its own unique dangers. The gun had to be pointed horizontally, just like pointing a rifle. The crew had to expose themselves to line up the weapon. There were no special sights for this kind of shooting. The gunner had to look past the barrel and estimate whether the gun was pointing in the right direction. Distance had to be judged by eye alone, not calculated on firing tables. The explosive charge was selected by instinct and experience, not by consulting mathematical tables. Everything about artillery that made it a precise science became rough guesswork. German machine gun fire tore through the air around them. Bullets cracked overhead, snapped past ears, pinged off the gun shields with sharp metallic sounds. Mortar explosions threw frozen earth and shrapnel in all directions. Snipers watched for any movement, ready to shoot anyone who raised their head. The crews had to work while under constant fire, moving fast, staying low, hoping every second that a bullet wouldn't find them. Yet still the crews stayed with their guns, loading, aiming, firing, steady hands, calm movements. Professional discipline. When a German tank appeared just 300 yards away, the crew loaded a high-explosive shell with a super-quick fuse. The gun roared as the shell left the barrel. It covered the distance in less than a second. The shell punched through the tank's thin side armor and exploded deep inside. The tank erupted instantly, flames pouring from every opening. The German crew inside had no chance to escape, no time to bail out. When German infantry charged across open ground, the crews loaded shells with variable time fuses that would explode in mid-air above the attackers. These airbursts sent shrapnel raining down on men who thought they were protected in foxholes and trenches. The killing area of an airburst stretched 50 yards or more. A single well-placed airburst could eliminate an entire platoon in seconds. German attacks would fall apart, survivors running back toward their own lines. One gun crew suddenly found German infantry less than 100 yards away. The loader grabbed a shell, crammed it into the chamber, and jumped aside. The gunner swung the gun left, tracking the Germans as they ran. The assistant gunner slammed the breech shut. The gunner pulled the lanyard. The howitzer fired with a tremendous roar. The shell reached the target almost instantly. The explosion threw German bodies through the air like dolls. The crew loaded another shell, fired again, kept firing until no Germans remained standing in front of them. This direct fire combat happened over and over throughout the siege. It became the normal experience for the 333rd. These were artillerymen who found themselves fighting like frontline infantry while still handling their main job of providing fire support. The crews switched constantly between firing their howitzers and defending positions with rifles and machine guns. When German infantry threatened to overrun a gun position, the artillerymen fought them off with small arms. Then they'd rush back to their howitzers and resume providing fire support for the paratroopers. The mental and physical strain was almost impossible to bear. Calculate firing solutions while making split-second decisions. Keep the guns running despite complete exhaustion. Defend against direct attacks. Do all of this while freezing, starving, and almost out of ammunition. The temperature never rose above freezing, not once. Frostbite stole fingers and toes from the men. Some of them urinated on their own hands just to make them warm enough to work. Sleep came in 2-hour blocks, then they'd be awake for 2 more hours, never getting enough rest to truly recover. They ate whatever they could find, mostly hard crackers and cold beans. Coffee was made from snow and used grounds that had already been brewed several times. The ammunition situation became dire. Batteries could only fire 10 rounds per gun each day. This meant every shot had to accomplish something real. Forward observers became extremely selective, requesting fire only on the most critical targets. Battery commanders became very cautious, refusing to shoot at targets that infantry or tanks could handle. Every shell was valuable. Every shell was needed for survival. Yet under these impossible circumstances, the crews delivered. They never failed. They never broke down. They kept fighting effectively under conditions that would have destroyed many other units. When infantry requested fire, the 333rd and 969th answered immediately. When tanks needed support, the artillery was there without hesitation. When German attacks threatened to break through the perimeter, artillery fire stopped them. The black artillerymen held their positions and performed their duty with a professionalism that earned respect from everyone who saw them in action. After the war, when German military records were captured and translated, they contained revealing information about American artillery performance around Bastogne. These documents, discovered in German military archives during the 1950s and 1960s, showed what Wehrmacht officers actually thought about American artillery. These were professional soldiers trained in the Prussian military tradition. They knew how to observe carefully and report accurately. What they wrote about American artillery shattered everything Nazi racial ideology had told them. One Wehrmacht regimental commander recorded his thoughts in a diary that would be discovered decades later in German archives. He wrote about American artillery fire that demonstrated devastating accuracy. The attacks would break apart before reaching the main defensive line. Advance seemed impossible. There was no way to locate and silence the American batteries. The fire came with professional discipline and didn't stop. Those troops couldn't possibly be the inferior Negro soldiers described in propaganda. This diary entry reveals something important. First, it acknowledges American artillery superiority directly and without question. Second, it specifically mentions race, something unusual in German military documents. Third, it directly contradicts Nazi propaganda about racial superiority. This was an officer who believed in Aryan supremacy, now forced by combat experience to doubt those beliefs. The reality he witnessed, the casualties in his own regiment, made it impossible to deny the evidence of his own eyes. A report from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division complained about the artillery fire from the Bastogne perimeter. The Americans fired heavier and more accurately than in any previous encounter. German casualties from artillery exceeded casualties from every other source combined. Every attack ran into immediate and precisely targeted fire. The American artillery demonstrated the highest quality. The report's significance lies in its specific details. Artillery killed more soldiers than rifles, machine guns, mortars, and tanks altogether. The report also noted that fire was immediate and precisely targeted, indicating excellent forward observers, efficient fire direction centers, and highly skilled gun crews. The final statement was praise without qualification. The American artillery was of the highest quality. No excuses, no caveats, just pure recognition of superior performance. A German battalion commander filed a report from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division that captured the desperation of the moment. His words revealed a desperate situation unfolding at dawn. American artillery had descended on their assembly positions before they could even launch their assault. The bombardment came in waves, concentrated and brutally accurate, leaving nowhere safe. The numbers told the story of catastrophe. 30% of his men lay dead or wounded before a single shot was fired in anger. The attack never happened. It couldn't happen. The men's spirits had shattered under the relentless pounding. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. The Americans possessed superhuman abilities, some said. They could see everything happening on the battlefield below. They could strike anything moving, anywhere, anytime. This report did more than document military facts. It revealed something deeper and more troubling. It exposed the mental destruction that effective artillery could inflict. German soldiers weren't just being killed, they were being psychologically broken. Fear gripped them like nothing else. They felt utterly exposed, defenseless against an enemy that seemed to strike from nowhere. They believed with absolute certainty that American gunners were watching their every movement. The reality was different, of course. But when shells are falling all around and men are screaming, reality becomes whatever feels true in that terrible moment. The terror created by constant bombardment became paralyzing. Men froze in their positions rather than risk movement. They hugged whatever cover they could find, too petrified to advance. Their willingness to attack simply evaporated. This psychological destruction proved far more devastating than the actual casualties inflicted. High-ranking Wehrmacht officers presented a problem that gnawed at their worldview. They had been trained in Nazi ideology from youth. They believed that black soldiers represented an inferior race, incapable of military excellence. This wasn't merely their opinion. It was doctrine drilled into their minds, reinforced constantly in their training and education, yet the evidence of combat contradicted everything they had been taught. The 333rd and 969th Field Artillery Battalions weren't supposed to exist as threats. They should have been inferior by the laws of racial science that Nazis preached. Instead, they were turning out to be among the finest artillery units operating anywhere on the entire battlefield. Their shells found targets with devastating precision. German positions crumbled under their fire. Equipment that had survived other battles was destroyed. Even more troubling to German officers, was what they observed about the soldiers operating these guns. These men demonstrated discipline that never wavered, even when circumstances became almost impossible to endure. They maintained their training, their focus, their standards. The transformation taking place in German officer consciousness wasn't happening because they wanted it to happen. These men didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon their racist beliefs. Reality simply left them no choice. Combat has a way of destroying comfortable lies. When theories about racial superiority collide with evidence of actual military competence from soldiers supposedly inferior, the theories shatter. Propaganda, when it meets truth on the battlefield, always loses. Racial ideology, when confronted with skilled soldiers of the supposedly inferior race, collapses under its own weight. Some German officers refused to acknowledge this publicly even after the war ended. They clung to their racist convictions despite overwhelming evidence staring them in the face. But others, in letters and interviews discovered in post-war investigations, acknowledged what they had learned through bitter experience. They admitted they had been fed lies. They recognized that military ability had nothing whatsoever to do with race. Combat had forced this recognition upon them, whether they wanted it or not. Soldiers who could deliver precise, devastating artillery fire under desperate, nearly impossible conditions could not be called inferior by any reasonable definition. The irony cut deeply. Nazi Germany had built its entire rationale for conquest on claims of racial superiority. Yet it found itself being defeated, in part by soldiers it had labeled as subhuman. The Wehrmacht, which took such pride in its tactical genius and military excellence, discovered it was being outgunned by the very units it had been conditioned to despise. The contradiction could not be escaped or explained away. Either Nazi racial ideology was fundamentally wrong, or the evidence of combat was fundamentally wrong. No rational person could possibly argue that battlefield results were mistaken. On Christmas Eve, the weather momentarily cooperated with the defenders rather than the attackers. German aircraft broke through briefly and dropped bombs on Bastogne, striking the town with deadly force. Captain Ray Chappell, serving with Battery Baker of the 333rd, was among those killed. Many others fell as the shells exploded through the garrison. Then, as if Providence intervened, the clouds parted further and revealed the sky. Allied fighter bombers finally pushed through. Transport aircraft made their way to the besieged city. Supplies fell from above, landing in the snow below. German positions came under attack from above. The siege grinding on, but something fundamental had shifted. Those supply drops meant hope. The defenders understood that freedom was coming. They simply had to hold on a bit longer. Christmas Day arrived with an eerie stillness hovering over the frozen landscape. Both armies, exhausted beyond measure, seemed to pause in mutual acknowledgement of the day. On Christmas, the men of the 333rd and 969th Field Artillery Battalions sat in their frozen gun positions eating whatever rations they could find. They were thousands of miles from everything they knew. They were fighting for a nation that had never treated them as full citizens. They were surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead simply because of their skin color. Yet something inside them refused to break. They held their positions. They never even considered surrender. They fought with unwavering determination. A letter survived, sent by Private First Class Samuel Ellis, serving with the 969th. The words he penned reached his family many weeks later. He wrote of Christmas surrounded by enemies. He wrote of running low on food and ammunition with no apparent way out. Yet his letter contained no despair. He wrote with certainty that they would not yield. He promised his family that they would hold their ground. He demanded that people remember that when everything was on the line, when all doubts surrounded them, the black artillerymen refused to break. On December 26th, relief arrived in steel form. General George Patton's Third Army punched through German lines from the south. Tanks from the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne's defensive perimeter. The encirclement was broken. The defenders had succeeded. American hands held Bastogne. The German offensive had ultimately failed. As the weeks passed, American forces drove the Wehrmacht back toward German soil. The Battle of the Bulge belonged to America. For their extraordinary actions during the fighting at Bastogne, Both the 333rd and 969th Field Artillery Battalions received the Presidential Unit Citation. This honor came on March 13, 1945, as part of recognition given to units attached to the 101st Airborne Division. This represented the first time the United States Army's highest unit award had been given to African American combat units in World War II. The citation recognized their extraordinary heroism displayed against armed enemies. The costs recorded in cold statistics revealed the brutality of the battle. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion had started the Bulge with approximately 540 officers and men under arms. When the fighting ended, 6 officers, including the battalion commander, and 222 enlisted men were dead, wounded, or captured by the enemy. The casualty rate climbed beyond 42%. No other artillery unit in the 8th Corps suffered greater losses. Despite these crushing losses, the survivors never faltered. They maintained effective fire support until other units took over their positions. They never lost discipline. They never stopped fighting effectively. Their combat record stood as irrefutable proof. African American soldiers matched or exceeded white artillery battalions in accuracy, discipline, and courage. The 333rd's achievements could not be denied or diminished. After the war, when American historians interviewed surviving Wehrmacht officers, the message remained consistent. These officers made no distinctions based on race. They acknowledged the quality they had faced. One former German artillery officer, speaking in 1952, described what he had witnessed around Bastogne. American artillery had been superb, he stated simply. Forward observers had displayed exceptional skill and judgment. Incoming fire had proven accurate and devastating. The crews handling the weapons had worked with impressive speed and precision. These soldiers possessed high training. They carried deep motivation. They were, undeniably, highly effective combat troops. After Bastogne, the 333rd returned to restricted duties. The Army faced an uncomfortable reality. So many soldiers had been lost that the battalion faced dissolution. Finding replacement troops for a segregated unit proved difficult. For months, whatever remained of the battalion worked as guards and laborers. The situation changed finally in April 1945 when sufficient replacements arrived. The 333rd was rebuilt and returned to active combat for the war's final weeks in Europe. The 333rd Field Artillery Group, serving as the battalion's headquarters element, continued through the Rhineland campaign and into Central Europe until Germany surrendered unconditionally. The unit ceased operations on December 30, 1945, at Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion itself was disbanded on June 10, 1945, in Germany. The men made their journey home to a nation that remained unchanged in its essential character. Segregation continued. Jim Crow laws remained in force. Their rights, for which they had shed blood, were still denied to them. The massacre at Werkrath faded from view. Investigations occurred, but prosecutions never followed. Contrast this with the Malmedy massacre, which triggered extensive war crimes trials and convictions. 11 black soldiers murdered brought no such justice. A 1949 Senate Armed Services Committee report documented 12 separate incidents of German troops massacring American soldiers and Belgian civilians during the Bulge. Werkrath, inexplicably, was excluded from this official accounting. The story sank into obscurity for decades. African-American veterans returned home and immediately encountered the discrimination they had known their entire lives. The sacrifices made by black soldiers in World War II faded from public consciousness. Larger narratives of American victory overshadowed their contributions entirely. Then, in 1994, marking the 50th anniversary of the massacre, something remarkable happened. Herman Langer, the boy who had watched 11 soldiers share his family's table and eat their final meal, erected a memorial at Werkrath. Now an elderly man, Langer had never permitted himself to forget what he witnessed. He placed a simple stone cross in that field. The names of 11 murdered soldiers were carved into its surface. It stood where they had died, a quiet act of remembrance in a tiny hamlet that most maps ignored completely. The memorial existed privately, almost invisibly, for several years. Then, in 2001, 3 Belgian citizens made a commitment to do more. They wanted to create a proper memorial honoring the Werkrath 11 and all African-American soldiers who had fought in World War II. They gathered funds, they purchased land, they constructed a monument worthy of the sacrifice. The memorial was formally dedicated in 2004, 60 years after the massacre had occurred. Road signs began directing visitors to Werkrath. The Belgian tourism authorities included the memorial in their Battle of the Bulge guidebooks. The story, which had been buried, finally started reaching wider audiences. In 2006, the Worcester, Massachusetts chapter of Battle of the Bulge veterans dedicated the first American memorial to the Werkrath 11. They placed it at the Winchendon Veterans Memorial Cemetery on August 20th. Another memorial followed in 2016, erected in Miller Park, Bloomington, Illinois, with each soldier's name clearly displayed. Finally, recognition came from the highest level. On September 19, 2016, the Senate passed Resolution 571, officially acknowledging the dedicated service and ultimate sacrifice of these 11 African-American soldiers who had been murdered at Werkrath. In 2017, United States Representatives David McKinley and Bobby Rush introduced House Concurrent Resolution 43 in Congress, providing formal recognition of the massacre. Justice arrived 72 years too late, but it arrived nonetheless. The men were acknowledged at last. Their sacrifice was finally recognized. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion's legacy continued beyond World War II. In 1946, the battalion was reconstituted in the Organized Reserve and redesignated as the 446th Field Artillery Battalion. It was activated on February 15, 1947, at Birmingham, Alabama. On July 1, 1959, the 333rd Field Artillery Group was reactivated as the 333rd Artillery Regiment, with both the 446th and 969th Field Artillery Battalions operating under its command. On September 1, 1971, the regiment received a new title. It became the 333rd Field Artillery Regiment. Elements of the regiment deployed in Operation Desert Storm. In 1991, the regimental coat of arms tells its history visually. A lion from Belgium's heraldry sits prominently, bearing the red and blue shield from Bastogne's arms, honoring the distinguished unit citation earned there. The white border symbolizes the encirclement of the city and the snow-covered terrain during the Bulge. A swordbreaker, an ancient weapon with barbs designed to catch a sword while preventing withdrawal, represents the breaking of enemy military power. 5 barbs stand for the unit's participation in 5 European campaigns during World War II. The lessons purchased so dearly through bloodshed eventually helped transform the entire American military structure. President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, formally desegregating the armed forces. The order stated unambiguously that all persons serving in the armed services would receive equal treatment and equal opportunity, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Implementation took years to complete, but the change could never be reversed. The 333rd and other African-American combat units had demonstrated that segregation was not merely morally corrupt, it was militarily counterproductive and wasteful. Master Sergeant Floyd Jones, interviewed decades later in 1983, spoke from his own hard experience. His words echoed through many of his fellow veterans. They had faced 2 enemies, he explained, the Germans firing from across the lines and racism operating from within their own country. They won against the first enemy in 1945. The Second War took considerably longer, but they ultimately won that struggle too. They had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that black soldiers equaled any soldiers walking the earth. After Bastogne, nobody with any sense could deny this reality. Even during the 2020 pandemic, when restrictions challenged normal ceremonies, the United States Embassy in Belgium maintained its commitment to remembrance. Diplomats and local officials gathered at the Werkrath Memorial in December, despite all difficulties. The obligation to honor the 11 murdered men had become woven into the diplomatic relationship between America and Belgium. The commitment transcended pandemics and challenges. The Werkrath Memorial stands today in that small Belgian field, marking the exact ground where 11 men died simply because Nazi ideology had labeled them subhuman. Visitors journey from distant corners of the world to pay their respects. Names are carved permanently into stone. Curtis Adams, Mager Bradley, George Davis Jr., Thomas Forte, Robert Greene, James Leatherwood, Nathaniel Moss, George Moton, William Pritchard, James Stewart Jr., and Turner. 11 men who knocked on a farmhouse door seeking refuge and received death instead. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion entered the Battle of the Bulge on December 16, 1944, positioned near Shomburg, Belgium. Within 2 days, the battalion lost half its personnel. 11 soldiers were massacred at Werkrath. 6 officers and 222 enlisted men fell as casualties or became prisoners. Yet those who survived regrouped and joined Bastogne's defense. Their artillery support proved crucial in breaking German assaults and protecting that vital road junction. Their skill and bravery merited the Presidential Unit citation they received. They proved conclusively that African American soldiers stood as equals with any troops anywhere in the world. For decades, their story remained largely unknown outside historical circles. But recognition finally arrived. The Werkrath 11 were honored. The 333rd's combat record was formally acknowledged. Today, historians, museums, and memorials across multiple countries preserve their legacy for future generations. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion's story is fundamentally a story about courage tested in the most extreme conceivable circumstances and proven absolutely genuine. It is a story of men who faithfully served a nation that had withheld from them the basic equality they deserved, yet they served with distinction and honor nonetheless. This is a story that demands remembrance because these men earned nothing less through their valor at Bastogne and their sacrifice at Werkrath. German officers who had underestimated black artillerymen learned the hard truth in December 1944. The 333rd and 969th Field Artillery Battalions delivered fire support as effective as any American units anywhere. The men dismissed as inferior demonstrated their true worth when pressure mounted highest. They held Bastogne. They shattered German attacks. They earned the highest honors. Their sacrifice illuminated a simple, undeniable truth: courage possesses no color.